Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've had a lot of time on Russia and a lot of people who claim to understand Russian mentality. But I'm not sure it's been mentioned that tomorrow is actually in the Orthodox calendar Christmas Day, so I shall be joining my Russian Orthodox wife at the service this evening and tomorrow morning, and I wish you, Madam Deputy Speaker, a very happy Christmas. I make no apologies for President Putin, and although I'm a former chairman of our all-party group on Russia, I certainly gave it up in the light of what happened at Salisbury and before. And no doubt he is running a corrupt regime. Although I did go to the Council of Europe with the Council of Europe delegation to look at a previous election which President Putin won, and there was no doubt that there were a lot of people voting for him because people felt that he had restored the pride and the greatness of Russia after the terrible, infinitely corrupt and useless years of Yeltsin, where we took Russia for granted. So I make no apology for President Putin. I don't defend him in any way, but I think the mistake of this debate is to assume that if there was any other conceivable leader of Russia, that their strategy would be very different. Many Russians felt deeply humiliated at the loss of territory, which formerly belonged to the Soviet Union. And we constantly hear about the invasion of Crimea and the Donbass region. We hear very little in this chamber about the fact that Crimea was, of course, part of Russia for 200 years. It was signed away by the pen of Khrushchev without the Crimean people being consulted at all in the 1950s, and there's no doubt at all that Crimea is overwhelmingly Russian and wants to be overwhelmingly Russian, and we have to respect their self-determination. The same applies to many areas of the eastern Ukraine. Now,
Will you give way on that point? I'm not going to entirely disagree, because I think he'll put a useful and alternative voice. But what he's saying as regards eastern Ukraine isn't really true, because ethnic Russians are not in the minority, and I think the majority, and I think he's getting confused between Russian speakers and ethnic Russians. And even in Crimea, he talks about the Russian people in Crimea. Crimea was historically Crimean Tatar, and they were the indigenous population. So you've had an awful lot of infill of Soviet military pensioners. That is different from the indigenous people.
I know that entirely, but when people go on about the fact that Crimea was originally Tatar, no doubt America was originally populated by Red Indians, but we don't say that America doesn't belong to Americans. So the fact is we've got to deal with the situation in the ground. All I'm saying is that there is an overwhelming feeling amongst Russian people of a deep sense of humiliation under the Yeltsin years, and like all countries, they yearn for strong government and leadership. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Right, honourable friend. The correct way for this to have proceeded would have been for Crimea to have held a referendum about its status in or out of Russia before the transfer of the territory back to Russia. But that didn't happen. It was like the Sudeten Germans being polled about rejoining Germany and being annexed out of Czechoslovakia by Hitler. It was exactly the same as that. And I think for my right honourable friend to somehow excuse what happened on the basis of historical populations really provides spurious credibility to a dictator.
But we are where we are. And I think one of the mistakes of these sort of debates is to equate Putin, for all his faults and his corruption, with Hitler. I would suggest that we are where we are in Crimea, and there's no doubt about the fact that the majority of the population want to be Russian. It may not have been transferred in the right way, but that is the fact. But Putin is not Hitler. And whoever becomes the leader of Russia, it is true that they will try and hold and build on the influence in territories which were part of the Soviet Union. That is Russian grand strategy. You may not agree with it, you may not understand it, but it is a fact of life. Now, this NATO point, I'm confused why people constantly argue that the way to solve this problem is for Ukraine to become part of NATO. US Secretary of State James Baker said to President Gorbachev on the 9th of February 1990 in recently divulged documents. I quote, "We understand that not only for the Soviet Union but for other European countries as well, it is important to have guarantees that if the United States keeps its presence in Germany within the framework of NATO, not an inch of NATO's present military jurisdiction will spread in an eastern direction." The truth is that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. It would be a provocative act, and in constantly talking about it in this chamber and in the West as if it's likely to happen, we are simply providing an excuse for President Putin to play the game of being the underdog, of Russia being threatened. So why do we do it when we know that actually NATO is never going to absorb Ukraine? Why do we go on talking about it?
Very briefly. Very briefly, my honourable friend is making a reasonable point as to whether or not something may or may not happen. Does he at least accept the point that free countries can choose to associate with whoever they like? Some join the European Union, some join the OSCE, some join NATO, some join ASEAN. Do the Ukrainian people not have a say in this, or do they actually belong to Russia?
Yeah, but it's not going to happen for this reason. Just imagine if President Biden, he's not the sort of president who's ever going to do this, by the way. He's a weak president. He's not going to suddenly elect Ukraine into NATO. We all know that. That's reality. But you should only let Ukraine into NATO if you were prepared to fight for it. If you were prepared to spill American and British blood for the frozen steppes of the eastern Ukraine, and nobody wants to do it. And by the way, if we did do it, we would lose our nerve very quickly. You know, look at Iraq. Look at Afghanistan. After a few years, if there were just 300 dead British soldiers, there would be tremendous pressure in this House of Commons to withdraw. Russia would simply stay. They don't mind if they have to wait 20 years or 30 years. So it's never going to happen. Ukraine is never going to join NATO, and if it did join NATO, it would be potentially disastrous. And in talking about Ukraine joining NATO, we are simply playing to Putin's game. Now, this other talk that we've had about the fact that Russia is a mortal threat to our country. This is not the Soviet Union. Russian armies are not placed in the middle of East Germany. Where is this mortal threat? We hear about all this hacking. No doubt Russia hacks. No doubt they have rather ineffective campaigns on Twitter. Are we so lacking in our faith in our own parliamentary democracy that we think we're going to be overthrown, or we're under threat from President Putin? This is not a strategic interest of the United Kingdom. Of course, any Russian government will seek to extend its influence. Any Russian government will be mortally opposed to NATO expanding eastwards. Any, or perhaps this rotten Russian government, might try and subvert aspects of our life. But why don't we have our self-confidence? Why don't we look to our own proper strategic interests? We have no historic or strategic interest as a country in Crimea or in eastern Ukraine. We don't understand it. We don't understand the history. We don't understand the complexities of the region. We don't understand the Ukrainian state in itself, which is divided. No, I've given away 3 times already, which is divided in itself. The second largest party in Ukraine is a pro-government, a pro-Russian party. It ranks very high on the corruption index. When they controlled the eastern Ukraine, they did everything they did to deny autonomy to Russian speakers in the eastern Ukraine. Well, you can agree with me or not, but you've got to understand that this is the point of view of many Russian people, and they are entitled to their view as much as we are. So, learn from history. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Iraq. We in the West are not prepared to fight for these people. Why are we destabilising the region by pretending that we would do when we know perfectly well, everybody in this chamber knows perfectly well, that we're not prepared to risk a drop of British blood? So we have to live with this Russian government. We have to stop talking about expanding eastwards. We have to stop playing to Putin's game. I know this is realpolitik. I know it's not sort of redolent of great liberal imperialist speeches about how we must make the world safe for democracy and the Iraqi people or the Afghan people or the Ukrainian people have a right to live under a democratic regime and what nonsense I'm talking. But this is the fact of life. This is realism. And are we really prepared to muck up the eastern Ukraine in the same way that we've mucked up Iraq and Afghanistan?